Petrus, and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspective on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've watched some of our content and liked our videos, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and donating on Patreon. Today, we're talking with Dr. Gillian Arendse. Dr. Arendse has a Ph.D. in experimental nuclear physics from Stellenbosch University and served for 10 years as a lecturer at the Department of Physics. He has since then appeared as a motivational speaker at various functions, at times encouraging students to pursue a career in physics. He currently works at Itemba Labs. Doctor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for the invite, Petrus. It's nice to be here with you.
Fantastic. Doctor, we were fortunate enough to chat to Professor Johan de Villiers a couple of weeks ago, and he introduced us to you. We'll talk later about your connection with the Libertas Choir. But more specifically, he encouraged us to talk about your absolute passion for physics and encouraging students to pursue a career in physics and its work. This is something that people have been fortunate enough in our country to explore, for the first time, I want to say the past 20 years. Before that, we had a time where this wasn't as available to everyone in our country as possible. We wanted to know if you had any experiences of the apartheid time era in terms of discrimination, perhaps against your career in nuclear physics and other people in the area that also wanted to pursue these technical fields.
Well, Petrus, I realize that I probably look older than what I am, but maybe I should start off and say, I was born in 71, which kind of indicates that, during the time of the 76 uprising, I was 5 years old. At the time of the death of Steve Biko, I was 6. And again, I think, my life, and I think that's true for everybody. Our lives are shaped by the context within which we grow up. So I grew up in Paarl, and during that time, obviously, you get exposed to different things. I attended the high school Polish Hubert in Paarl, and it's a school that was, in a sense, known for activism, and known for students who were involved in some of the protests and the conversations. The late Audrey Foss was a young guy. I think he was killed in '85 at the age of about 19. So he actually matriculated at Polis, and because of that context, I think you grew up in a situation where you were exposed to different things, and through those formative years, you became more aware of the struggles of people. In many cases, I was removed from that. Occasionally one of my neighbors would get detained, and you would hear about those kind of things. But I think as I grew up, I was involved in sport. So I played a little bit of volleyball under the banner of what was known as the South African Council of Sport. And they used to say, listen, we can't have normal sport in an abnormal society. So I grew up separate from other people. I played my sport separate because, we use sport actually as a vehicle to raise issues and concerns. And I remember, as I was growing up at a stage, we moved from, let's say, playing under the banner of SACOS, we moved to unification. And I remember how, the one day we walked into a hall filled with guys with whom we used to play. And at that stage, we now joined, let's say, the other side of the fence because we wanted to create new opportunities for some of our younger players. And they stopped the game and asked us to leave the hall. So guys that we used to play with actually just said, sorry, we don't want to be associated with you. And I think that is the level often of the experience that people had. People who used to grow up together suddenly found themselves on different sides of the fence. And even though the discrimination was maybe not necessarily physical, I think, people went through trauma. I remember when I applied to Stellenbosch University, my application was unsuccessful. And of course, I, in a sense, couldn't understand why. Yeah. And the reason I ended up going to Stellenbosch is actually because of my dad. Because he phoned the university and said, listen, my son has got let's say, a B aggregate. So if he does not get accepted, that means that everybody who studies at Stellenbosch must have an A aggregate.
Yes.
I then got a call to say, okay, you are welcome to come. You know, so again, I was the only one from my school in that year that went to Stellenbosch.
Right.
But again, I think, you know, if you talk about the severity of the discrimination and how you felt left out, I think sometimes it was subtle. Other times it was a bit harsher. I remember one day, you know, I was involved in some outreach stuff with colleagues from the then Institute for Mathematics and Science Teaching. And we went up the West Coast, you know, looking for accommodation because we were visiting various schools. And the colleague then said to me, you know, they couldn't get accommodation at the one place because the owner said that they don't allow people like me, you know. So even with my PhD, I couldn't get a bed to sleep on.
Yeah.
So I almost felt like baby Jesus, you know.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, but that was you started your studies in 1989, right?
89. Yeah.
Yeah, it's 1989. So it was very much at the end of the era. But you know, you said that you struggled to get a place to sleep, even with your PhD. So that means that discrimination lasted way longer than what we see as the end of the era, which is what, the 1990s to 1994.
Yeah, and I think that's the reality. I think, you know, we often speak of apartheid as if it's something that's no longer there. You know, the fact that, let's say, we took it off the books, it doesn't mean that it's not still lived. It's still experienced. You know, we are still separate. I think we are still mindful of each other because we live in fear. And because of this uncertainty, you know, that keeps us separate. So instead of us coming together and figuring out how we celebrate the diversity and how through that we become better, we still kind of, you know, everybody sticks to their own. And I remember one year I visited Belgium. I was in the town of Leuven. And I was walking with a Japanese student, and we went into one of the pubs, you know, so we had a beer late at night. And as we came out, the bouncer, security, stopped us. And he demanded that we pay him because he allowed us access to the facility. You know, so just because we looked different, we had to pay. And of course, the Japanese student just took out money and paid. And I said, hell no. You know, this is not even my country, but in my own country, this would not, you know, be tolerated. So there's no way that I will be subjected to this kind of treatment in a different country. But I think that's the reality. You know, it's still with us. We are still grappling with it. We're still trying to figure out how we move beyond, how we learn from each other, and how we really, you know, open up to conversation. And I think one of the things I'm sad about is, you know, a friend that I met couple of years ago is Peter Jones. I don't know if you know the name Peter Jones.
Unfortunately not. No.
Peter Jones is referred to as often, if you Google, as the last black man to see Steve Biko alive. So Peter Jones was with Biko when Biko got arrested. They were, you know, kind of detained separate, and Biko was killed, and Peter Jones was his friend, didn't know about it. He only found out weeks later. And one of the things that I'm in a sense sorry about is that I didn't spend enough time sitting with Peter to have these conversations, you know, to find out what was it like. What was it like to journey with somebody like Biko? What are some of the lessons learned? And the sadness actually comes from the fact that Peter Jones suffered a stroke about almost 2 years ago, and he's unable to speak. You know, so I never had that conversation, but I think I must still, maybe one day I'll still have the conversation, even if it's just in my own head with him sitting there. But I think, again, we miss out on these opportunities to learn from each other. And as you say, to figure out how these things have impacted people's lives and how we learn from that to start shaping a better future.
Yeah, and there's a lot of opportunities. I know of a couple of stories. I think The Diving Bell and The Butterfly is a book about a person that also suffered a medical emergency, and yet through extremely arduous situations, he was able to write this book, which later on inspired many, many people. So I hope there's an opportunity like that for Peter as well. But I also know that for to study physics, to start with that industry, if we can get it back to a bit of your more professional life, that must have been something that you were inspired to do. Did it start with your inspiration in nuclear physics, or was it just pure physics? And like, what role models or people, particular moments, made you choose to go down this path?
Well, I think, if one looks back, then obviously there would probably be a number of people that would jump out. But I think, my journey, in a sense, when I was done with school, I had this realization that even though, my mum was not very happy, that I would not go and do medicine. Because for some reason, I just thought that I will not be able to deal with people suffering on a daily basis. They would come in and they would be horribly sick. And
Right.
something within me I'm going to force myself to tell a joke, So I realized that medicine is not what I want to do. When I got accepted to Stellenbosch, at that stage, I did what people call the 4-subject option. So I started off with mathematics, applied mathematics, computer science, and physics. And the reason I think for choosing physics was, if I think back to my schooling career, we used to do physical science. Obviously, we do physics and chemistry. And our then teacher, who had the nickname Fuck You Willie, he would teach chemistry, but we would always teach chemistry, and he would say, by convention. So we never had chemicals. So if we had chemicals, we would mix them. The experiments would never work. So if something was supposed to turn blue, then his would be pink. And he would say, well, as the textbook says today, even though it looks pink, it is blue. And I just think, I never got that connection with chemistry. And maybe it's, because of the schooling, the quality of our infrastructure and equipment. So I probably leaned more towards the physics, which is more, linked to the problem solving. And then, when I got to Stellenbosch, started with the 4 subjects. After the first year, realized that, computer science is not my thing. Because I didn't even own a computer. So I had to go next door to my cousin, and, he helped me out as we journeyed from the floppy drive to the stiffy drive, to the memory stick that we have now. And then it just kind of continued. So actually, Johan de Villiers, I had him as a lecturer in first applied mathematics. And then later on, I had him as a lecturer in mathematics as well. But, for me, the journey continued. I then ended up majoring in math and physics. And because I come out of a family of teachers, there was this voice that, okay, you probably need to go and do teaching. So I thought, well, okay, let me first do an honors. And I then did an honors in physics, because I was kind of more drawn to the problem solving, the creativity and taking big things and breaking it down into small little blocks. So did the honors, and then after the honors, thought, okay, let me go and do teaching. And at that stage, one of the lecturers in the department, Prof. Anthony Cowley, approached me and said, listen, do you have a bursary to go and do teaching? So I said, no, I don't have a bursary. So he said, well, I've got money if you want to do a master's in nuclear physics. So there I was. Always struggled to pay my account, because my dad had to figure out how to do that. So he offered me a bursary. I then did the master's. After the master's, he offered me another bursary, and I ended up doing a Ph.D. So before I knew it, I was 8 years full-time student at Stellenbosch, and I journeyed all the way through until I walked away with a Ph.D. But again, looking back, I mean, I think the love for the sciences probably at a school level. There were a couple of teachers there, that inspired, and then coming to Stellenbosch, there were a couple of lecturers that I bumped into that kind of tricked me into liking physics more, just because of the way they were doing things. And I think that is it. So I don't have an Isaac Newton story where I sat under a tree, and something fell on my head. I think for me, it was just circumstances. I happened to be at a place at a particular time, and opportunities were presented to me. And because I was open to that, I think the journey just went from there.
Yeah, and also, being inspired by the people along the way, even though that one person might not necessarily stand out. I think it's very important to acknowledge, every single teacher that taught you physics had an influence. Your colleague had an influence. Everybody along the way had an influence in terms of motivating you to further your career in physics. This motivation, as a current motivational speaker, and you encouraging people to follow a career in physics. Did these small roles play a part in the transition that you went from as a lecturer at Stellenbosch University to the communications portfolio at Itemba Labs, which is South Africa's nuclear research labs?
I would say yes. I think what happened. If I kind of reflect back, I was full-time student for 8 years. Then after graduating with a PhD, I started with a junior lectureship. And obviously, when you come in as the young guy, the new guy, you are the one teaching the big classes, right? So you kind of get dumped into teaching at an undergrad level for the so-called service courses. So a lot of the time and energy went into becoming better at communicating science. How do I talk about physics? How do I make it accessible to an audience who not necessarily, they're not there to pursue a career in physics. They're there to, further careers in biology or chemistry or whatever. Yeah. So it's trying to teach them the skills that come with the subject and not necessarily the content per se. So I think for that first couple of years, the focus was on how do I become better at communicating this stuff, which is kind of tough. So I need to do it in a fun way, but I also need to help them understand that just because it's fun and cool, it doesn't mean that it's not tough. And I think that is probably where the journey started. So it was becoming better at talking about things, taking the complexity and breaking it down into little bite-sized pieces. And over the years, I think I got better at that. And because I was at Stellenbosch, I was able to go back to my old school, for instance, and do a bit of outreach, to say, maybe my physics teaching at school was not always wow, because we didn't have access to equipment. I am now at a place where in principle, I've got access to equipment. I've got access to expertise and skills. So let me take that back to school and let me see if I can, ignite a bit of energy and passion, not just amongst the learners, but also amongst the teachers, because they are the ones who spend most of the time with the youngsters. And I think that is more or less where I would say the shift happened, where I moved away from the hardcore science and moved more to the communication of the science.
And you're pretty damn good at it. I know that Professor Johan de Villiers and various other people that know you told me that you're a natural speaker. You like to motivate, you like to communicate, you like to motivate people to follow the things that they're interested in. And I'm very excited or very happy that the fact that science communication is an actual profession these days that a lot of people pursue in terms of making either videos online like YouTube. There's a lot of science communication channels. There's a lot of motivational speakers. How exactly would you recommend someone to follow a career if they feel like in their community, say they're qualified in a STEM field, if they want to communicate to their community or they want to motivate their community, how exactly would you recommend them starting that?
Well, I think it's really about, in a sense, almost finding your own story. But in that, realizing, the importance of having purpose. So if you want to go into the communication game, then you need to understand why you're doing it. So I think early on, well, not early on, I think life is a process where we grow and figure out who we are and what we can do. But I think over time, when I realized that I've got an ability to connect with people, it was really then about saying, okay, so what is my story? I remember a conversation that I once had with what is the guy now, De Grucci, up Gillian Arendse. And he said, he's got a question that he wakes up with every day, and that's the question that fuels him in terms of why he does what he's doing. And the question for him was, how do I want the next generation to live? And I think I almost, to some extent, adopted that question by saying that for me, you know, if we want to build a more just, more accessible future for young people, we need to invest in them. So if we want kids to be creative, to be inspired, to be connected, committed, then we need to find ways to take that message in. And like you say, you know, even if I reflect on my own life, there are people who stand out, and it's important to understand that we all need role models. We all need people that we aspire to. And the way we do that is, I think, through storytelling. You know, so when we tell stories, that allows people to connect with us, it helps people to feel, but it also moves them to action. So anybody out there who says, listen, I want to get into the game of exciting other people, it's maybe important to say we don't necessarily just want to be motivational speakers. We probably want to be motivational teachers. So how do we teach people to be motivated? But also then understand, you know, why it is that we do that. What is the energy, the fuel that we get from that ourselves? Because it is something that tires you. You know, people look at me and they might think I'm an extrovert. I'm actually not an extrovert. I'm an introvert. But maybe I have a persona that I kind of step into. And that's what you need to claim. But you need to believe in your own story. You need to know what you're selling. And I think then it becomes easier to maybe move on.
That's actually also incredibly important, because I feel like there's, you know, the abundance of motivational content on the internet in terms of, you know, posts, and, you know, you always have this iconic image of, you know, a nice, beautiful background and then some motivational words above it, or a video that has some music on it that stirs people. Like, these stuff is really, really cool, and they're really fun to watch, and they make you feel very powerful when you read them or when you watch them. But turning that motivation that you have in that moment into action is actually the difficult part. So do you also provide people, when you motivate them, with an avenue that they could clearly follow, or how do you help them put that motivation into action as well?
Well, I think sometimes it is there, you know, where you allow people to reflect and to maybe almost write their own kind of commitment statement, you know, to say, I commit to whatever. But I think often what happens is that as we share stories, you know, it's that sometimes my pain becomes somebody else's inspiration. But that only works if we are willing to become vulnerable. You know, and I said the other day that, you know, I started looking at the word COVID, and I decided that COVID for me is short for connect with your own vulnerability, so that you can become intentional in terms of how you deal with discomfort. And that is really what I think we are trying to do when we claim that we're trying to motivate people. You know, I mean, you just want people to own that, one, you know, they are autonomous. They can make their own decisions. Two, they need to become the masters of their own craft. But thirdly, they need to connect with a purpose, with a life purpose. And sometimes, you know, it can be an action step where you say, write it down. But I almost say, you know, if I talk to you and tonight you can't sleep because you're thinking of me, then maybe that's good enough. But also it's just, you know, through those moments and realizing that we're all on a journey to become who we are destined to be. So it's not just what you are, but it's actually who you are becoming, you know, and that is a daily struggle for everybody.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. And I mean, for people to wake up in the morning and then feel like they have something, a goal that they work towards, something, you know, that they aim to achieve, is incredibly important. And giving that to people, I think, in various departments, whether you're necessarily a motivational speaker or just someone that's very successful in your field, especially in nuclear physics, when you discover something new, everybody that, you know, is interested in that field and sees it, they're like, man, that's really cool. I want to be able to do that as well. Or I want to create these useful things for other people as well. It gives them a sense of purpose and direction. Going back a bit to your background in physics, we chatted to Professor Johan de Villiers about his connection with mathematics and music. You're both part of the famous Libertas Choir, which, you know, I want to say is one of the beautiful success stories in South Africa for taking motivational to a new level in terms of seeing what's positive in the world and working with that. They're an absolute symbol for it. But for him specifically, we asked him if there's a connection between mathematicians and musicians, because there's quite a few notable mathematicians that are also musicians in history. Do you also feel like there's the same thing? Because I know maths and physics are closely related, but physics is the experimentation, the observation of the natural world. Is there a beauty in the natural world that you observe that you also observe in music, and they're intertwined?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I think music lends itself to things like creativity, um, and that for me also sits in the natural world. Where you get confronted with a specific challenge and you have to come up with creative solutions. And I think for me, when I think of music, it's music is a language, and because it's a language, it comes with certain rules, and that is almost similar to physics, where in a physics context you often start with a problem. The problem needs to then go into a space where you can draw a picture depicting the problem. Once you've drawn the picture, you have to add some concepts to it and to your picture. And once you have that, you have to convert that picture into mathematical formulae. And once you have the formulae, then you can do the math, the rigor to actually solve the problem. And if you're lucky, you get to an answer which you then have to interpret to bring it back to the natural world. And I think, that is almost like that same kind of flow that I think you get in music. You create this thing with the intention to connect with some kind of audience. Then you package it in a way, you promote it and you sell it, and you hopefully get the feedback that you connected with individuals, that you move them at an emotional level, and that feeds you back into the system. But I also have to say, I think I got into the choir just because of my looks. So not really because I can do anything else. Mm-hmm. But I think my looks are going now. So I don't know how long they will still keep me in the choir. But again, I think for me, the choir is also, a place where I can practice, in a sense, my communication skill, because I'm still communicating. I'm just using a different vehicle. And at some stage, as I'm growing, I looked at my own name. And I decided that I'm going to give meaning to each letter. Mm-hmm. So if you ask me who I am, I'll say I'm Gillian.
Yes.
And I'm a gifted individual who loves to learn, inspire, affirm, and nurture. So that is me. And I think, music for me, again, is just an opportunity to celebrate and to share my gifting. Again, I come out of a education family, but I also come out of a musical family. My dad was the organist in the church, and he studied music, etc., etc. So everybody kind of played something. Dad always said he's not going to teach any of his own kids, so he would pay other people to rather teach us. So I did a little bit of piano and then stopped. But again, so I think music is kind of something that I've been exposed to from a young age. It was always in the house. It was when we wash up after Sunday lunch, then all the siblings would of course be on duty, and we would get through that process of washing up with singing, and that is just the three brothers and a sister. We just kind of blended harmonies, and again, it's with singing, suddenly stuff that we didn't want to do got done. So I think music also then became a motivator to some extent.
Yeah, and I also want to say it's one of the beautifully natural. In South Africa, we have this habit that when we have strong emotions, whether it be anger or happiness or whatever we do, there's a natural tendency to burst into song. Almost want to say, like, I think some of the only communities in the world that I know of, I'm sure there's many more, but the ones that I know of, that when we're angry and we protest, we tend to sing. We tend to combine our emotions with music, and it's intertwined. And there's an understanding, or I just want to say a preconception about fields that are almost want to say, you know, very, very technical mathematics and science and natural and physics, that people kind of disconnect from the arts. So, you know, I know for a fact that in you know, at least on the internet, in popular culture, people talk about the STEM fields, which is science, technology, I think it's education and mathematics. And then you have the arts. So they create this clear line between the two. I think there's a modern movement called STEAM, which then includes arts in that name, which I find quite cool. But the point being is that you've clearly created a bridge here that shows that these two things are clearly interlinked. Why do you think there's a preconception that these two are separated? And do you think it's just something that's just of the past and is now currently breaking down? Because I know other people in the Libertas Choir are also incredibly talented in very other technical fields, and yet they're all part of this choir.
Well, I think maybe, you know, in a sense, traditionally, we would think of human beings as either logical or feeling. And I think for a long time, we associated the arts more with the feeling side, and we associated, you know, the STEM, the science, the tech, the engineering, the math, more with the logic, you know. And because you are logical, you kind of follow process, you follow structure. But I think, you know, as we chatted earlier, I think there is a lot of structure in music, but there's also room for creativity. And I think the beauty sits in the fact that, you know, when you express yourself in the sciences, there's a lot of creativity that sits there. And I think that is what we're realizing, that we shouldn't compartmentalize things. And maybe that's why we now go from STEM to STEAM, because we realize, you know, that is actually needed. And I'm just, you know, reminded of a conversation I once had with a guy who said that, you know, almost, I think he was an engineer or something. And he said the most valuable subject for him was Latin.
Okay, that's interesting.
And again, just because of the language and the structure, you know, and I mean, I remember a conversation I had with somebody who was in risk management, but more in the computer science. And this guy kind of hinted and suggested that the best predictor of somebody becoming a good programmer is actually not mathematics and physical science. It's actually how proficient that person is in language. You know, because computer programming, it's a language.
It's a language.
Got structure, it's got rules. And if you're okay with languages and you understand how things work, then it actually feeds into the other side. I think we're starting to see that these lines are being blurred, because we can actually say that, yes, you are a scientist, but that also means that you should be able to move, you know, you should be able to be creative. So I kind of sing and I can dance, and I'm in the choir. I know Johan is also in the choir and he can count, but yeah, so if we start dancing, you must not watch him. we tend to go in opposite directions sometimes. But I think for me, that is also just fascinating, you know, how the brain allows you to keep that structure and the body does something completely different. But I think that's the beauty of who we are as human beings.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I also want to talk about, you know, you have a PhD in experimental nuclear physics, which for anybody that's not in physics, you know, maybe an arts field, that sounds like the most impressive PhD you could get in this, you know, breaking edge technology. And then I want to ask, how exactly do you apply the knowledge that you learned in your PhD and what you did your PhD on in terms of your work today? Because I know there would be a preconception that, hey, you have a PhD in nuclear physics, you could do some cutting edge experimental nuclear physics research. And then some people might be, you know, find it weird that you're now spending your time rather motivating people to study physics. It doesn't negate the PhD, but how exactly does that? How do you combine those two?
Well, I think for me, you know, a PhD, it says, in essence, just says a couple of things. You know, it says that you are structured, you can meet deadlines, you can start stuff, and you can finish it. But I mean, the PhD in the physics, or in my case, not the experimental physics, I mean, that speaks to being able to take a problem, break it down into little building blocks, devise a strategy, you know, to investigate whatever it is you're trying to do, and then go through that process. And I think for me, in terms of the motivational teaching, that is often the same process that I go through. You know, you think about what is it that you want to deliver. You then figure out what is the best vehicle, which is almost like saying, okay, design your experiment, look at all the little things that you're going to need. And again, I think that is just, again, the context, that space within which the creativity comes through. And I think for me at the moment, I think the nice thing is because I've moved back to Itemba Labs. Itemba Labs is obviously a research facility for nuclear physics and applications. And I find myself where I am probably could refer to myself as a translator, because we sit with the scientists on the one side and we sit with the public on the other side. There's a need for our science to become relevant. And in order for your science to be relevant, your science needs to be able to impact communities. But in order to talk about the impact, there's a need for the community to understand the scientist and vice versa. And I think for me at the moment, the nice thing is because I did the science, I can in principle understand the scientists. But because I've also now done a fair bit of dabbling in terms of communication and promotion and advancing science, I think I also understand the public, which means that I'm able to translate what the scientist is saying into a language that is accessible for the public. And I think that is, at least in my current job, I can serve as that conduit so that information can flow. And I mean, it's similar within the organization as well. We are a research facility, but we have only a number of scientists, and then we have a lot of people supporting the research endeavor. And it's important for people in the organization to understand what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. And again, that translation of how do you take the high level internal communication and how do you make it accessible so that, let's say, one of our housekeepers, if you ask them, why do we exist, that they are able to answer that question. So I think for me at the moment, because I'm back in science, I think I can play that translational role. I'm not a science journalist, but I understand the science and I understand a little bit of the communication, and that makes life a little bit easier. And then, as I say, if I had to go now and advance or talk about science in, let's say, a school context, then again, it is understanding the context and then packaging the information so that it actually gets to the audience.
Yeah, and it's also a skill in terms of, I know we talked about, being someone that's in a background of physics and so on, and then going to a motivational, which is a very, almost want to say, extroverted role in terms of where you need to get energy from talking to these people because that's what allows you to go forward. But you yourself said that people might think that you're an extrovert, but you're actually an introvert. And your love for physics and working with this is something that's also very commonly associated with more introverted people going to the more scientific, isolatory, the research roles where they have to sit down, they have to work hard, and they have to study for a certain amount of time. But you were forced to almost gain these skills or adopt the skills of an extrovert to be able to do this fully, to communicate, to motivate the people. This is something that's actually quite interesting because I feel like a lot of introverts are required to be able for their work to be recognized and appreciated. Like you said at Itemba Labs, it needs to be talked about, right? But that means that they have to gain the skills to be able to communicate what they've done more clearly in terms of more layman terms so that people that will benefit from this, which aren't experts in the fields, can appreciate it. What exactly would you, what tips or advice, what starting points would you give to people that aren't very good at public speaking, aren't very good at communicating their field of expertise, especially if it's very technical, to improve that, to work forwards and be able to communicate with people better from personal experience?
Well, I think the first step is, as you say, to get out of your comfort zone. Because I think, again, part of the, let's say, the PhD journey includes the need to be able to write, and it includes the need to be able to talk, right? Because, often you have to do a defense of your degree, etc. But I think the challenge is that often in those contexts, you always end up having conversations with people who understand what you're talking about. So you talk with other scientists or you go to conferences where everybody there knows what you're talking about. And therefore you don't have to define concepts or acronyms. And I think, the challenge now is that as people understand the importance of getting the message out, they need to force themselves almost to step into those spaces. You know, and people often say that the number one fear in life is public speaking, and the number two fear is death, and the number three is dying while you are busy public speaking. You know, so I think that kind of scares people. But again, I think it comes for me back to, you know, conviction, purpose. If your job is to inspire the next generation of young people to pursue what you are pursuing, and if you believe that, you know, through that there's growth and development, then obviously you need to get out. And I think it's often you see how researchers or scientists or even lecturers at university, why they are sometimes shocked, you know, where they say, but I'm so good, why don't people come? You know, surely they should know that I'm brilliant, and they should be knocking on my door. And you know, for them to understand that if you don't put yourself out there, nobody's going to know who you are and what it is that you're doing. And I think that is the challenge, is to nudge people out of their comfort zones, to say, listen, go and give a non-specialist talk. The first one might be horrible, but let's go and do it, and open yourself up to feedback, so that then, you know, you get feedback and you become better. But again, I think that speaks to, you know, what I referred to earlier about mastery. You know, you have to become the master of your craft. And you know, we're not saying you have to be the best speaker in the world. We're saying you have to be the best at your research, but you at least need to be willing to share that. And if there are, like, you know, people like me who can assist with that, then, you know, by all means, let's work together, let's partner. I know I still have a lot of growth left. I'm not yet there, wherever there is, and I will probably never get there either, because, you know, becoming a master is kind of asymptotic. As you get closer, you realize that you're not yet there, and you keep going, and you're just never going to get there. But again, that's the excitement and the beauty of the process.
Yeah, it's experience, and you gain experience every time you walk out there, and every time you talk, you get, you know, you make a mistake, you get a little bit better at it. But you know, for someone like you who had so much experience, do you still get nervous every time you talk?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I owe it to the audience to be nervous. Because it might not be the first time that I, let's say a specific thing or address a specific topic, but it might be their first time that they're listening to me, you know. So if people give up their time to be there, I need to honor that. And therefore, I owe it to myself to be nervous. And I would be very worried if I'm not nervous, you know, because then you're like, yeah, I can do this with my eyes closed. And I never want to get there. So nerves for me is part of the process. You know, so I go through that every time, and sometimes I have to trick myself into being happy. So sometimes, you know, I would be dead tired, but once I step on that stage or platform, I just go. And at the end of that, then I probably have to go and sleep. But yeah, so the energy is there, the adrenaline just kind of kicks in, you kind of get this alter ego. But yeah, I think it's important for me. I owe it to the audience to always be nervous.
Yeah, and I just have to say, as a fellow introvert, I definitely, whenever there's a social interaction or there's public speaking, you know, you're incredibly nervous and it builds up, and then the point comes where you have to talk it, and then you just do it, and you hope that it works out, and it's almost like an alternate personality, and everybody that knows you as an introvert is like, wait, what? This person is publicly speaking so well. What's going on? This is not the person we know. But what they don't realize is that even though it might be looking that it's going well, it drains you with like of all of your energy. And you know, the second you're done there, you're exhausted, and you have to go and rest and recharge your energy again, by, you know, being alone, doing what you enjoy. Do you have any like notable stories from the many functions you've talked at? Do you have any notable experiences in terms of how the audience have reacted towards one of the things you've talked about, or how a bad experience turned into a good one? Any of those you might be willing to share?
Well, I mean, I've had the opportunity to try this a couple of times. I remember I was once invited to host the unveiling of a piece of medical equipment at one of the hospitals in Kuilsriver. You know, so I think they bought a new scanner. So they had this whole unveiling, and they had little events, in the parking area. They put up like a Bedouin tent, etc. And I was asked to be there. So somewhere between announcing and trying to be funny, but I'm not really a funny kind of guy.
Mm.
And I remember there was a guy sitting, a doctor, I'll not say the name, right in front, and there I was, all nervous, trying to get going. And this guy just looked at me, and he just wouldn't give me anything. He had a face that was just dead.
Oh no.
And obviously, the more I looked at him, the more it bothered me. And then you kind of go through the process, you get to the end, and the organizers come to you and say, brilliant, well done, thank you for what you're doing. And I think for me, the learning in that was that whenever you scan the room, there will always be one or two people that give you the dirty eye. And what I need to do is to make sure that I don't track those people. I need to track the other people. Because if you focus on them, you work harder and harder because you're trying to win them over. And like you say, that takes more out of you as the presenter, because you're draining yourself, And I mean, there's an old saying, what other people think of me is really their business. If they don't like me, that's their business. If what they think of me is wrong, it's my job to show them that they are wrong, but I can't force them, And I think that is for me been the learning. But there's also been, a couple of times where I would, let's say, go to a school and you address matriculants or whatever. And I remember the one time, I can't even remember where I spoke. And then I was in a shopping mall, maybe a week or 2 or 3 months, a couple of months later. And this random guy just kind of walked up to me, with a trolley. And he stopped me and he just said, listen, I just want to say thank you. You spoke at this function. My son was there, and he's now on his way to Australia to go and do what he wanted to do. And I'm like, wow. Thanks for sharing. But I think often it's always good for me not to know. So it's good to find out a couple of years later, but I actually don't want to stand there and think that, I'm about to change the lives of millions of people. I actually would rather want to hear feedback many years later that somebody says, oh, I still remember you. And I mean, these things happen. I would go into a bar, let's say a bar, and there would be a barman who was in matric 10 years ago. And I would walk in and he would say, aren't you that guy who came to our school? And my wife would be like, there must have been many people who went to that school after you. Why would this guy remember you? And I think those are the kind of, special moments where you feel that, even if it was just for that one person, it is still worth the effort.
Yeah, that's also really important as, if you do public speaking and you have an audience in front of you, every person there that sits there has their own life, their own priorities, their own things that they're currently talking about. And you'll get people across the entire spectrum, people that are thinking about something else, that don't really care that this person's here. I remember from some of the motivational speakers that we had at school, at that point in time, I was way more worried about, the homework, about the next, lesson that was coming along than what this guy was saying.
Yeah.
And he might be looking right at me and I was just blank faced, not caring what he's saying at all. So, you have those people, and then you have the people whose lives you change. So realizing that there's these intricate differences in the people and all of those among you, it almost makes it easier, realizing that you can't control everything that they think. And it's not your job, as you say, to win them over, what they think of you as their business. That's a fantastic quote, by the way. I love it. So I just want to say, for those people that you do inspire, how precisely do you encourage them to pursue physics specifically? What outreach programs are you a part of, aside from the communications role that you currently fill at Itemba Labs?
Well, at Itemba, we have a small group that's actually involved in what we call science engagement, right? So they are actually working with the schools more directly. So at the moment for me, at some stage when we talked about, creating an awareness of what science and mathematics is, I think the focus for me was always on trying to, almost in a sense, demystify and to make young people realize that, it's part of life. It's part of everyday life. So the emphasis was always on using everyday stuff as the basis for the conversation or the explanation. And that is always what I try to do. So in terms of a presentation or a little workshop, there was, for instance, one that I did on sound, where we'd end up, using test tubes, mm-hmm. and you add water so that you can change the pitch. And we end up playing, the first part of the national anthem using the test tubes. And again, it was in a sense bringing the arts together with the mathematics, together with the physics, all into the same mix, and just saying, listen, this is part of life. The way we think about life, that's science. And I think that for me, the sad thing is that often when you look at the way science gets taught at schools, the focus is really on, I almost want to say, getting the right answer.
Yeah.
And in the process, the learning is lost. So kids don't get to think. They don't get taught how to think critically, how to ask the right kind of questions. So, I had a conversation with a grade 11 student the other evening, who's also struggling with physics. And as she was trying to explain to me how she goes about solving a problem, you hear that old thing of what is asked, what is given, what is the equation, let me plug it in and get the answer. And now you have to take her through the process of saying, no, start with the words, draw the pictures, put down the physics, put down the equations, and if you can do mathematics, you'll get to the answer. So I think the way in which I think we should excite people about science is to remind them that it's an everyday phenomenon, even though it is sometimes complex, but we should bring it to real, to reality. So that the education becomes relevant. So it's really about taking the physics to them. And if we talk about, I don't know, free fall, take a piece of paper and take a rock and show them that, if you crumble the piece of paper, they fall at the same rate. And then we can talk about, things like air resistance, because often in school, at the top of your question paper, it says, ignore air resistance.
Yeah.
So why the hell do we tell you about it if we say in the question, ignore it, but we haven't convinced you why it is okay to ignore it, let's say over a 5, 10 or 20 meter kind of range. So again, I think it's important to focus on everyday stuff and to help kids understand and appreciate that they have the basic skills to make sense. You can observe something, and based on that observation, you can make a prediction. And if it's wrong, then we learn. If it's right, we have to unpack and ask ourselves, was it a guess or was it based on, solid science? And again, that's the opportunity for the learning and the teaching that we should never miss.
That's actually a fantastic point, because I do feel like there's a disconnection in terms of the way in which science is taught and the prioritization of science classes at school, and in terms of what it actually is and what people discover that have a love for it when they study it later on in a more relaxed environment. We had the opportunity to speak with someone who had their education was in chemistry. We spoke to them last week. Their education was in chemistry, but later in their life, they went into business. And they became incredibly good at their business administration because they would break down a problem to first principles. And then we look at the fundamentals of the problem and then build it up from that point forward. And that way of thinking actually benefited them, even though they were incredibly successful in chemistry, it benefited them in other ways in their life as well. And perhaps in school, when we teach physics, we prioritize getting the answer right, getting the marks, getting the qualifications, or getting the foot in the door for a physics or so degree, more than the way of thinking, which might actually benefit other people as well. So in terms of, talking with you, you've talked with a ton of students at schools, how would you perhaps pass the idea along to them that even though you have no interest in going into physics as a career, for whatever reason, that the way of thinking can benefit you across all sectors? And perhaps how could we change the schooling system or the way physics is taught to show that?
Yeah, I think what happens in schools often is, people tend to focus on performance, so everything is performance driven. And like you say, we lose the learning, the benefit of the struggle. Right? And I'm always amazed when you talk to somebody, let's say, who enrolls for, let's say, chemistry at a first year level at a university. And when you talk to the young person, the person will say, no, listen, I chose science because I enjoy problem solving. I enjoy struggling. But then they choose the subject, and the moment when they struggle, they decide that they want to opt out.
Mm.
And then you say, well, but there's a bit of a conflict now, because the reason why you got into science is because you enjoy the struggle.
Mm.
Now you have an opportunity to struggle, and now suddenly you want to get out again.
Mm.
And I think that's a challenge. We've become so performance driven. It's like saying there's a difference between getting an A for French and being able to speak French.
Yes, very
Now,
much.
the schooling system is geared to getting guys to get A's for French, and it's not teaching them how to speak French. And I think that is what we need to figure out, how we shift that. But I mean, if I take my own life now, I mean, yes, I've got a PhD in experimental nuclear physics, but I failed mathematics in grade 11.
Mm.
Now, if I had gone to school today, if I failed mathematics in grade 11, I'm sure that my teachers would have advised me to move to mathematical literacy.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that is our current way of doing. So we're at a point where we speak to young people and we decide on their behalf that they are either good enough or not good enough to pursue certain subjects when they get to grade 9.
Mm.
So based on a performance up to grade 9, we decide that, sorry, mathematics is not your thing.
Mm.
And that's why you should maybe rather do mathematical literacy, instead
Mm.
of saying, it's the school's job to ensure that after 3 years, that those guys who want to pursue mathematics fully understand what mathematics is. But at the same time, the school needs to ensure that the rest of them pick up the skills, the strategies, and they are able to use that, as you said, with the example of the chemistry business, they're able to transfer that across to other disciplines. Because I think with technology and changes now in things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, there's a need for us all to be able to think differently, to reason differently, to see differently, but also to understand why we see. Not just what we see, but why we see. So if that is the kind of stuff that you find by default in subjects like mathematics and physical science and life science and whatever, then we should encourage more kids to do that. But we need to separate, that the skills from the content. And I mean, for me, that was always the challenge when I taught, let's say, a first year physics service course, where a student would come and say, oh, electricity, I don't understand this, and then I would say, well, just slow down. If I do physics, then I do 3 years of electricity. And at the end of 3 years, I still don't understand electricity and magnetism. So if a physics student has to do that for 3 years, why do you think that I can teach you electricity in 2 weeks? And if that penny drops, then they realize the subject is just a vehicle to, one, expose them to the content, but two, it's more about, how do I go about solving problems? What do they call it? The metacognition, the thinking about thinking.
About thinking.
So asking yourself, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And will it help? And if you don't have answers to those 3 questions, then you have to stop. Because then you go from being a novice problem solver and you can transition into becoming an expert, because you are constantly thinking about your own thinking. But I think that is what we need to figure out, how to help basic education teach that at school. Because I think with COVID, we just became aware of the inequalities in our schooling system. So yes, we spoke at the beginning about apartheid, and we say it's gone, but kids are still living, through, I almost want to say, that legacy. They're still being challenged, confronted with the fact that they don't have equal access. And if we want to build the next generation and create a more just society, we need to make sure that every kid has got access to the best quality of education that we can offer as a country, irrespective of where they go to school.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly important, and I feel like there's been, especially in fields, specifically STEM fields that focus on radical innovation, the companies that do those, more and more of them have this kind of speech where they say, "We don't really care what your degree is. We don't care about how qualified you are or where you studied. We want to know if you have the skills or not. So rather give us a problem that you solved, that was in this field that you're pretty good at, and then we'll consider employing you." So, radical innovation is already moving away from the structured case of performance evaluated qualifications. And yet we've seen very little radical innovation in terms of the way formal education is done. Informal education actually has been, changing dramatically over the past couple of years. If you think about, I think Khan Academy was one of the first, inspirational resources, school resources that people could use outside of school. But that wasn't seen as a formal education, or at least it wasn't seen as formal education until recently. And we have so many other videos and science communicators online and internet and other platforms that really inspire people, that give them a way of thinking. Like you said, you use your PhD's way of thinking in terms of how you communicate science today. So how do we radically innovate formal education then, so that the qualification basis that everything else has always been like tagged onto, all this innovation has been tagged onto it, but the structure itself is still quite crude? How do you go about that? Do you create a school that you completely change the way in which students learn and then certify that somehow, or get people to trust it? How do you radically innovate in such a structured environment?
Yeah, I mean that example would probably be a fascinating study to try and do to
Yeah.
create that kind of ideal space within which we equip people in the way that we want them to be equipped for the future. But I think if we look in terms of where we are as a country and as a society, I think we need to find ways to change the way in which we train our educators. I think we are still training them the way we trained them for the past, I don't know, 20, 30, 50, 40 years. So we sit with education faculties that are, let's say, maybe specialists in the education, not necessarily the content, but they are responsible for training these so-called teachers. And a lot of them are so disconnected from the realities in school because they themselves have either never taught or they haven't been in school for a very long time. So the practices that we teach are, in a sense, disconnected with the reality because we kind of train teachers for a very specific kind of school. And that does not exist, throughout the country. So I think we need to radically change the way we equip and prepare our teachers. And then in terms of, I think the whole experience is to find a way to embed almost like an experiential learning within the learning process. Because like you say, if the market is saying, show us what you can do, not what you have as a qualification, then any student who's studying needs to be able to build up that portfolio throughout the 3 years of study. Because if you can't do that, you're going to get to a point where a company says, right, show me, which means experience.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have a catch-22. You're going to have a young graduate with no experience who now needs to try and find experience, but nobody wants to employ them because they're unable to convince people that they've got the skill set. So you've got that kind of weird catch-22 circular, and we're never going to break out of that. So we have to find a way to embed it. So universities need to create, even if it is little startup companies where students can work at while studying, so that they get stuff on a CV that can serve as let's say, experience. But in terms of basic education, I think we radically need to change the way we train educators, equipping them with, again, the right skills, and for them to be able to journey with young people, become these aspirational role models, and not say, I'm here to teach, let's say, a specific subject. Some kids want to master that subject because it's linked to what they want to do with, in terms of their own life journey. And other kids just need to master the skill. But you need to be a seasoned facilitator of learning to be able to manage that complexity, where you give the high flyers the content, and the rest you give the skills, but up to a point where everybody feels that whatever you offer is value adding. But I think that's a challenge, and we need to break the silos, where you teach only physics in the physics class. You need to teach physics in Afrikaans class, and you need to teach Afrikaans in the physics class. So we need to find ways to break the silos and for learning to become the key driver and not the specialization.
I think that's a fantastic perspective, because then you're using the current system, because I think it would be quite unfair if you created a new school to almost experiment with the students that are in there and tell them like, hey, we have this radical new way of teaching. You guys are like a test trial, and we don't really have people that believe in the school just yet. It's not quite fair of them. But taking the existing system and enabling and equipping the teachers with the tools and the expertise to be able to communicate this better, that's using the existing system to almost more streamline the way in which students are educated. I think that's a great idea.
And I just want to say, to add, we have to do that. Otherwise, we end up with education becoming elitist. I think we already have 3 educational systems. We have public, we have private, and then we have the X model C. And depending on where kids go, they get exposed to either more or less. Yeah. And that impacts, their opportunities to access higher education. So you have this vicious cycle, and kids are unable to break out of poverty or their circumstance because the system doesn't allow them. So we have to work with what we have, but we radically need to change what we offer by, I think, equipping teachers and also getting teachers to reconnect with their passion and their purpose, for being in education. And then maybe we can start building and creating a more just society.
Because when times get tough, and it definitely gets tough for teachers, they need that internal motivation to be able to go on and keep inspiring these kids. I know for a fact that's something that you can realize as a student when you're sitting in their class, when somebody's passionate about what they're talking about or not. It really relates through that and keeps them going. So, yeah. Doctor, we want to thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate this. Has been a fantastic, interesting talk. We want to give you opportunity to add a last thing or plug something if you'd like to.
Well, if I just want to add this, especially for those in education and in teaching, as I say, I come out of a family of teachers. So my dad was, principal at a primary school in Paarl. And the school was located in an area that you could, let's say, label as the scheme. But both parents, mum and dad, and I think what we grew up with was the notion that we as siblings all attended the school where my dad was principal. And the other 3 siblings, they actually had my mum as their grade 1 teacher. So she used to teach at little farm schools. And they actually attended, grade 1 in those contexts where she was a teacher. And I think what both parents taught us, even without saying it in so many words, is that if you are an educator or a lecturer or whatever profession you are in, if what you offer isn't good enough for your own children, please don't offer it to anybody else's. No. And if we can adopt that philosophy as a philosophy of life, treat every person as if it's your brother, your sister, your mother, your child, then I think we will go a long way in terms of remedying some of the broken relationships that we currently have in our society. If we see people for who they are and for who they could be, then maybe we've got a chance to turn a lot of things around.
If you love everybody around you like family, and you're future oriented in terms of the kids that you teach, I think that the whole perspective changes in terms of how you deliver whatever job you do. So thank you so much for those words. We want to slightly off. We want to say goodbye. Well, thank you so much for our viewers for watching WorldView. If you've made it this far, you definitely like the discussions that we're having. So please consider subscribing, liking this video, and enabling us to make more of them by donating on Patreon. We thank again Dr. Gillian Arendse for chatting to us there. This has been WorldView. Thank you for watching.